Always like to talk Kennedy. Kennedy is my entire life. I think that it is the most important event in American history, possibly world history, because of the results that we've seen from it. And so, yeah, I haven't had any problems dedicating my entire life to this course of study.
That's awesome. And I made that clear as well in the monologue that this is one of the most important events. It changed the dynamics of entire world. And whenever I look back, lots of people say, oh, well, one of the biggest events in the past 70 years was 9/11 or something else. It's like, yeah, all of those events only happened because of Kennedy, of what happened to
Correct.
Kennedy that day. So let's start off. Really simple. Are you going to solve our game of Cluedo and tell us it was Lee Harvey Oswald in the book depository with a dodgy rifle?
No, as a matter of fact, I would like to correct the record on that and state with certainty that Oswald never worked at the book depository. He probably never stepped foot in that building, and he most certainly was not there on November 22nd, 1963. Most people
Right.
don't seem to really be able to grasp how I can say that because we seem to have stories of Oswald being dropped off in the morning by Buell Frazier. We have people interacting with Oswald throughout the day. We have allegedly Robert McNeil and Pierce Allman who saw him as he left the book depository. So we have all of these stories about a man named Lee Harvey Oswald who allegedly worked at the book depository. But when you really get down to brass tacks, what it turns out is that Oswald didn't work there and that he was being impersonated in the book depository by a man named William Seymour. And that name, William Seymour, should be very familiar to Kennedy researchers because he was involved with the anti-Castro operations going on down at No Name Key, going back all the way to late 1960, early 61. So by the time of the assassination, you've got multiple years of multiple people impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald, creating this legend of Oswald. That none of it's true. None of it's true. Oswald never went to Mexico City. Oswald never worked at the book depository. Oswald never did any of the things that people attribute to Lee Harvey Oswald. And the evidence for all of this presents itself in glorious fashion on November 22nd, when William Seymour is clearly stopped inside the building numerous times. He's seen fleeing from the depository. And best of all, he's captured in the Robert Hughes film. So
Yep.
yes, to really get down to understand that, you really got to read my book, A Warning from History, because it goes into hundreds of pages on the setup of Oswald in the years leading up to November 22nd.
So how did you get into researching the JFK assassination then? What was it that led you into that? Because you said you made it your whole life. I mean, you don't make
Right.
something your whole life without having like a starting point. What made you
Sure.
so enthralled in it?
Well, it was I've been intrigued by it since 91 when the JFK film came out, which is funny because that ended up turning out to be an Israeli propaganda film.
Mm.
But at the end of the day, it was 2018. I had just spent about 3 years on World War II and the Holocaust, which I've recently returned to actually. And after kind of wrapping up that phase of research, I kind of understood how to begin to do real research at that point. And I was like, well, now's the time. I need to know what happened to Kennedy. And so basically, I spent 3.5 years, 12-hour days in my bedroom. I didn't leave to do anything other than study Kennedy. And so at this point today, I've read upwards of 130, 140,000 pages of documents. And documents are a big part of my show. I do a daily podcast on Kennedy where basically I read the documents to people and kind of analyze them. So, but I just
And
needed to know. And at that point, I'd kind of figured out how to be a historian. And so I just needed to apply those skills to it.
so how did you start when you were telling this story to other people? When you
Mm.
started writing the book, how did you start telling the story? Where did you decide to start?
Gosh, I think I started with the mafia because it was obvious the mob was involved. But when you really come to understand the mafia is not who you think they are. The mafia is not controlled by who you think controls them. And so when you really come to understand the mafia, you really come to understand that in 1963, you have this partnership of sorts between the CIA, the American mafia, and the Israeli Mossad. And they're one organization in 1963. They're inseparable. And you can go back and you can kind of trace the origins of these relationships, particularly with Israel and the US mafia, back to ultimately Ben Gurion and Meyer Lansky, who partnered up directly to pull off the Sonborn Institute, which lasted, I'm sure you're familiar with Sonborn, the pilfering of our military surplus post World War II, which everyone thought was being sent to the anti-Castro Cubans. But let me give you a plot twist. None of those weapons or none of the money ever raised for the anti-Castro Cubans ever made it to them. They were all deflected through a company in Virginia called Interarmco, which was a CIA front that basically provided weapons, money, and arms to the Israelis to fight the Palestinians. So when you go back to and you really analyze the Kennedy assassination and you look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine today, there is a direct link here, a direct connection. It's not even like 10 steps removed. If Kennedy had lived, what was going on in Palestine and Israel would not be happening today. So that is an angle of the Kennedy assassination that no one ever really thinks of or considers. But when you really start to get into like the weapons smuggling that was connected to Sonborn and all of the various bunkers that were broken into when all of our World War II surplus was stolen, particularly by guys involved in Kennedy like David Ferry, Sergei Arcacha, Gordon Novell, Leighton Martins. All these guys were directly involved in that stuff. And that is the direct link to Israel. Not only that, you start to dig really deep into New Orleans and you get into the relationships between David Ferry, Clay Shaw, other more unknown CIA guys like Martin McAuliffe or Kent Courtney. There was an entire propaganda infrastructure in New Orleans connected to Latin America and South America with guys like William Gaudet. But these guys also doubled in kind of managing the Cubans that were in New Orleans. And when you really start to dig deep into this stuff, what you'll find is that the motivations for helping them had nothing to do with really Castro in general, right? Most of the Cuban operations were cover fronts for the raising of money and arms for Israel, which is crazy because you don't really ever hear of anyone else talking about that. And so to me, the relationships between what's going on in the Middle East and Kennedy being killed they're inseparable.
Yeah, that's an amazing, because I from my research, I mean, still today, I think that's the forming of the big gray intelligence blob that we see today. So why was Lee Harvey Oswald chosen to be the patsy, and how do we know he didn't fire the kill shot? I mean, you said it wasn't even him, but I mean, there's a lot of people who would say, "Oh, I dispute that," or etc. So what would you say to that?
Right. So first off, in regards to Oswald and his ability to even fire a rifle, when you go back and you look into the origins of the rifle and also the revolver that he allegedly ordered, you'll find that the money order that was used to order the rifle was a fake. Money orders in 1963 were done on hard cardstock, but when you look into the photocopies of the money order that were allegedly used, it was obviously made on paper. This ink bleed through to the back. So unless Oswald was going around using forged money orders, it was a planting of evidence after the fact by the FBI. And actually, I've been able to trace the planting of the evidence back to a single lawyer who worked for the FBI who came up with the vast majority of the stuff that they don't have originals for anymore, which is exactly the case. And the same thing with the revolver that Oswald allegedly ordered. It's not even the same revolver that showed up. He ordered one revolver, a generic, and a Smith & Wesson that cost $10 more showed up in its place. And it was rejected from the post office and ended up at a place called Seaport Traders, where a man named Paxton picked up the handgun and signed for it. So when you dig into the fine details of Oswald, the rifle, anything connecting him to anything, you'll find that all of the things we've been told, all of the fine detail points are fabricated. They were made up after the fact. Oswald is undoubtedly a patsy, and the question is, why was he set up? Well, he was undoubtedly involved in one of two CIA programs. Originally going back to 1955, there was a program called Operation Redskin, and it was the blanket program to get people into the Soviet Union. Ultimately, it was reorganized by 1959 under a program called AE Balcony, which came to an end June 1st of 1962. When did Oswald leave the Soviet Union? The first week of June, 1962. Oswald, I'm pretty sure, was part of this AE Balcony program, which basically was designed to get a spy into the Soviet Union using legal means, whether through education, school visas, regular travel, anything like that. However, when he was there, Oswald made the mistake of bringing back a Russian spy in Marina Oswald. And I believe he was ultimately chosen for this, number one, because of his communist bona fides that they had already established for him. It would be easy to pass off. But I believe he pissed off a bunch of people when he brought back a Russian spy with him. And so I think that was kind of like the final decision making on why he was the one chosen. It's really strange, though, when you look at like the dates of when things were done, like when did they order the rifle? When did they order the handgun, which was proof of like the setup began earlier than March of 63. And from what I can tell, the green light to go ahead and do this operation involving Oswald and most of the nitty gritty details was formed sometime between January and February of 1963 at the winter meeting of the company Permindex, which was basically a front company, a Mossad front company founded by George Mandel. And it was ultimately a conduit of global intelligence. It had members of the United States Mafia, the CIA, Corsican Mafia. I mean, you had ex-Nazis like Hallmar Schacht. You had all kinds of people involved in Permindex. Permindex had a sub-company called Centre Mondiale Commercial, which was based technically in Italy, but it was ran out of Montreal by a guy named Louis Bloomfield. Louis Bloomfield, direct connection to Clay Shaw and David Ben Gurion. And Louis Bloomfield really is the ultimate like center of the wheel, connecting everybody in this assassination. But the direct connections are to New Orleans and Clay Shaw, Sergio Arcacha, David Ferry, and a guy named Kerry Thornley, who I've documented flying up numerous times to Montreal under aliases to meet with Louis Bloomfield, going back, to March and April of 1963. So we have all of our main players down in New Orleans, who are actively involved with CIA, actively involved with Mafia, actively involved with go-betweens to the Mossad through corporations like the Schlumberger Corporation, which was run by a guy named Jean de Menil, who was also on the board of Permindex. So, yeah, when you get into the why of Oswald, I think it was mostly convenience, but also when you get into deep Oswald research, you'll find that there were two Oswalds during his growing up. We have duplicate school records of him at the same time in two different places, mainly Fort Worth and New Orleans. So we have we've got about 4 or 5 years of duplicate school records and evidence that's showing that there were actually two children being raised as Lee Harvey Oswald all the way up until the time that Oswald joins the Marines, which is a whole nother twist, which was mostly covered by a guy named John Armstrong.
Wow, that is an amazing sort of revelation. Is something that I've always wondered. These multiple Osborns, Oswalds, you go back in time and try and work out what happened, and they don't go back very far. And you wonder, I always wondered where that would lead if you kept going. That makes a lot of sense. So, right, you're mentioning like amazing researchers there, of course, as well. Who, I mean, a lot of us researchers, when we're doing investigative pieces, a lot of our research is where we find stuff because we're working off the backs of giants. And you're pretty brave to be entering into such a contentious event, which has been covered by every angle by so many different commentators and researchers. Have you had much pushback, or have you had praise from other JFK researchers so far?
No, Kennedy researchers hate me. They don't even acknowledge my work exists. And every once in a while, they'll cherry pick parts of it and then try to claim it's their own. It's really kind of funny because it's all in my book. I beat everyone to the punch. I identified the 3 tramps. I mean, I solved the Tippit shooting. Tippit was shot by 2 men, Kerry Thornley and David Ferry. There's no angle of this assassination that I haven't worked out the nitty gritty on. And really, when you come to understand what they were doing, they were basically setting Oswald up and preparing for this assassination long before the assassination was even decided on. And I believe originally what they were doing was they were trying to continue to establish these communist bona fides to get Oswald into Cuba. But I believe somewhere around February or March of 63, that idea went out the window and he was repurposed for this assassination when it finally went into place. Because you can go back and you can look at them giving the name Oswald in various places as far back as like Bolton Ford in January of 1961, where Kerry Thornley and a guy named Lawrence Howard went into the Bolton Ford dealership, tried to get a bunch of Jeeps for the Friends of Democratic Cuba, which was being run out of Guy Bannister's office. But at this time, Oswald's still in the Soviet Union, provably. So somebody gave the name Lee Oswald to try to buy a bunch of trucks in January of 61. Why would they do that? They weren't planning on killing Kennedy in January of 61. It had to be to continue to establish communist bona fides to repurpose him to go to Cuba. When you look into the Mexico City incident, really, it turns out that he never even went to Mexico City, and he was being set up there by a guy named Kerry Thornley. And Kerry Thornley, when you dig into his background, it turns out he was in the Marines with Oswald. He knew Oswald. He had some of his handlers after the fact were people who were in Oswald's Marine Air Squadron Group Number 1 at Atsugi that he was later sent to after Oswald had left Atsugi. So you see a recycling of handlers for people who were originally handling Oswald, who then handled Kerry Thornley, and then Kerry Thornley went to go set up Oswald. So it becomes obvious that some of Oswald's initial handlers were in on his setup, double crossing him from the beginning. So,
yeah, Lord Melbury in the chat said, just to go back a little bit, said, wasn't Judith Ferry Baker and I don't know if I pronounced that right, the girlfriend of Oswald?
She's a liar. I don't believe a damn word she says. She's contradicted herself more times than I can count. And she claims to have made a phone call to Oswald at the book depository. And I can prove Oswald never stepped foot in that book depository. So she's a liar. Everything she's ever said should be discounted.
Mm-hmm. So why was JFK? Why did he have to be murdered? Why so publicly?
Ultimately, he was going to shut down the Israelis. He was going to pull all funding from the Israelis because of their refusal to allow inspectors into the Dimona nuclear reactor, which they're not even supposed to have, right? So ultimately, he was going to make sure that Israel as a country ended. He was not a fan of Israel from the beginning. He'd never been able to have any diplomatic ties with them because they continue, as Kennedy said, all they ever do is lie. And not much has changed after 60 years. So he was ultimately going to shut them down as a country over Dimona, meaning pull funding. And once we pulled funding from them, they can't survive on their own. They're a parasite nation, and they would have been destroyed by the Arab nations, within months of us pulling funding. Period. So that's why they killed them.
Yeah.
Okay, it becomes really easy to prove when you get into the relationships of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Rabin and Yitzhak Shamir, who were all in Dallas on November 22nd.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The players who were involved and who were in Dallas, that's really interesting. There's a couple of questions from the chat. I'm looking over at the chat. I see the first question I want to ask is from Mally Bites, who says, did the passenger in the front seat finish off JFK with his pistol?
No, that's from just a bad lighting in the Zapruder film. Although the driver, William Greer, 100% in on the assassination. Also, everyone in the Secret Service car, 100% in on the assassination. The Secret Service car, when it pulls into Dealey Plaza, has 10 men on it. 2 of them get off, Dave Powers and Clint Hill, meaning there should only be 8 men on the car. However, by the time the Secret Service car gets past the triple underpass, they're back to having 10 men on the car. They mysteriously picked up 2 passengers along the way. And that's clearly evident in McIntyre photo number 2, if you want to go and take a look for yourself.
Oh, that's a really nice, concise answer there. And Dark Commission asked a question. Now, he's asked, after all this time, with at least most of the people dead and gone, at least most of the people, what's the point of further research? I actually had a question that said, is there anyone still alive today who was directly involved in the assassination? So maybe you can answer the two together.
Sure. Yes. Number one, this is the most important event in American history because it's the day America died. America came to an end on November 22nd, 1963, and we've been in a vassal state, a colony, if you would, of the nation of Israel.
Okay,
Period.
that's a pretty serious answer.
Well, look at what's going on today. They're murdering Palestinians in scores, and we just keep giving them weapons. Why? Because on November 22nd, Israel killed our president and took over our country. They implanted crypto Jew Lyndon Johnson as president, and he handed them the keys to the kingdom. Evidence for this can be substantiated through the Liberty and the dozen other events involving Egypt and Middle East, which we could probably go into on another show. But the evidence for the fact that Israel killed Kennedy and took over our country and we continue to exist as a vassal state is, to me, the evidence is more and more every day when we continue to fund these lunatics.
And Johnny Dollar in the chat also has a question. He said, is the theory that JFK's body was switched in flight to DC true?
I'll give you this much. There's something to that. I don't know what. Look into a guy named John Liggett, who was a mob funeral reconstructionist. There's a lot of smoke around this, but I have not taken the time to really dig into the minute details. There's a lot of things that I know there's a lot of smoke, but I haven't gotten to the fire yet, and that's one of them. I can tell you with certainty the photographs of Kennedy's head in the autopsy are fakes. If you look into what is called the Harper fragment is a piece of occipital bone that was picked up in Dealey Plaza belonging to Kennedy. It's proof that this section of his head was blown out, but none of the autopsy photos show that. So a lot of people think that like J.D. Tippett was a body double swap thing. I think that's a garbage misinformation. But at some point, they did do some manipulation with Kennedy's autopsy photos because none of them are correct or accurate to what really happened.
Okay, so the money shot, we could call this. What does your research show, or who does your research show fired the shots, in your opinion?
Yep. Well, there were two shooters on the grassy knoll. The first shot came from David Ferry, who struck Kennedy in the throat. And the final shot came from none other than Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. Jack Valente, who Jack Valente was a longtime spook working for CIA. I have documents proving he worked for the CIA. He lied about where he was during the motorcade. He lied about where he was after the motorcade. And even his alibi witnesses, I've been able to debunk all those statements in chapter 6 of my book. So when you go into the Jack Valente section of my book, the whole thing is dedicated to debunking every single bit of alibi he provided for his where he was when Kennedy was shot. So,
Yeah, he seems like an extremely important character as well in US history that has been sidelined, of course, for good reason. Well, good reason for the bad
right.
guys. What were the politicians' part in the assassinations then? Because we're talking here about the nitty gritty. But what were who were the ones who were really behind this at a political level?
Well, it's when I look into like Kennedy's men, I look into the two most obvious people were Dave Powers and Kenny O'Donnell. And Kenny O'Donnell, who was, he was a Catholic Irishman. He was supposed to be like personal friends with Kennedy, had his back on a personal level. But when you get into Kenny O'Donnell's activities, Kenny O'Donnell was in the Secret Service car who picked up two passengers along the way and never reported that. Kenny O'Donnell was directly responsible for having the president's body taken back to Washington and not having the autopsy done in Dallas. So Kenny O'Donnell was like blocking the proper way things should have been done the whole time. And so when it gets into like bigger people, was it Lyndon Johnson know this was coming or any of that? I don't buy into any of that because Lyndon Johnson's a puppet and you don't give your puppet too much information to begin with. And if he knew the assassination was coming and was ever questioned about it, he would have information. He could lie. He would, could be caught in a lie. You can't risk that with your puppet. So anyone who thinks that Johnson had anything to do with it, I don't think so, which to me, the evidence would contradict that, right? Because Jack Valente, I'm saying, shot him and he was Johnson's right-hand man. How can you justify that? Well, it makes perfect sense if the relationship was vice versa and that Valente was actually Johnson's handler in the White House, which is what I believe. So,
Right.
but yes, everyone surrounding Johnson was in on this. Everyone surrounding Kennedy was in on this. But can I say Johnson was in on it directly? Absolutely not. Like I said, the guy never won an election. He was put into positions of power by forces greater than himself, I'll say. And so, yeah, anyone who thinks that Lyndon Johnson was a mastermind of anything doesn't understand history.
Yeah, I do think Lyndon Johnson, he looked shell-shocked in all of the images and pictures of that day. He looked like he's like, oh my God, whoever did this really did this, and I kind of I'm now gotta take over, and he didn't look like he knew it was coming. So personally,
Well,
that's how I feel anyway.
as soon as he got back to Air Force One, he gets back there relatively quickly. And Godfrey McHugh, who was general, he was Kennedy's advisor, military advisor. He searched Air Force One for like 15 minutes and he could not find Johnson anywhere. He eventually locates Johnson in the bathroom behind the president's office. And Johnson is crouched down in the shower and he's bawling like a baby, saying, "It's a plot. It's a plot. They're going to get us all." And
Oh
then
wow.
that didn't appear in the history books until 30, 40 years later when an interview was given to a journalist and Godfrey McHugh actually confessed that. So, yeah, I don't believe that Johnson was involved or had any knowledge the assassination was going to happen. I'm more of the belief that his Secret Service knew and he didn't.
Yeah.
Guys like Lem Johns.
I want to just make a couple of notes from the chat. Little Carol said she's so over the JFK assassination. so
Well, that's because you don't understand it.
Oh,
That's because
but
you don't understand it and you need to.
little Carol understands more than you think. I've met her. She's a force to be reckoned with. Don't ever mess with little Carol. I can promise you that. Joel Allen says, "Was Jack Ruby assassinated?"
No. Jack Ruby had cancer going back to the 40s. He was constantly
Oh.
fighting cancer his whole life, and he confessed this to multiple people. And Jim Garrison has numerous documents showing that Ruby had cancer, at least in 62, 63, before the assassination. So no.
Right. Okay. Dark Commission says, Fair enough answers, thanks. And he says hi from a fellow Hughes, so he just wanted to quickly
Oh,
say
thank you.
hello from a fellow Hughes here. Right, okay. So what you were saying there, it's taken like 50 years or whatever for information to come out, but this is the same. Why is it that the truth behind the Kennedy assassination has taken over 50 years to come out? Why is this when most of the people are now dead or dying?
Well, it will uncover who really controls our country. And that is more relevant today than it's ever been in history.
Yeah.
As we continue to just funnel billions of dollars to Israel. I mean,
Yeah.
our government has really just become an Israeli exploitation device. Really, that's all it is. They're pilfering our coffers. That's it. That's what this has happened. That's the end result, is that you have Israeli and Jewish forces that are basically pilfering us as a nation and leaving us like Detroit.
Yeah. Well, now you've done all of this research. So what do you make, and you mentioned it earlier, of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, and also what do you
Right.
think of some of the main JFK researchers who were involved in researching that movie, like Jim DiEugenio?
Right. Jim DiEugenio is a traitor to his country. That movie was produced by Arnon Milchan, who was a confessed Mossad spy who smuggled nuclear triggers out of our country, directly connected to Kennedy, directly connected to Benjamin Netanyahu, who was an employee of his who assisted in this. So if you go through that movie, those idiots left us enough Easter eggs to know that they did this. So there's a couple scenes where people are reading newspapers in that film. Pause it and go look at what articles are in those newspapers that they're reading. That'll give you a big hint as to who was behind the assassination.
Right, that's amazing stuff. Why do you think that they'll ever release the rest of the evidence within our lifetime?
There's no point. There's nothing in there of any value. I'll tell you exactly what's of value in the documents. The David Morales file, okay, because it'll show he was in Dallas and it'll show his relationship with the grassy knoll shooter. Then you have files on Charles the Blade Turing, who was a mob guy and a close friend of Jack Valenti. Those are still being withheld, and those are being withheld because it'll establish the relationship there. And then you got documents on a guy named Harry Hall or Harry Haller, another mob slash CIA guy who was involved with Jack Valenti in some deal for Jeeps that was using White House letterhead. And Harry Haller got busted. Most of those documents are still withheld under the JFK documents. So those are the three documents that I think are the most important. They'll establish the relationships between Jack Valenti and the CIA. And those are the documents they're never going to get. We'll never get out, but we don't need them because I'll tell you exactly what's in them. So.
I like your confidence, or cockiness, one of the two. I don't know, but no, confidence. I'm going to call it confidence. What was George H.W. Bush in Dallas that day, and do you think he played a role in the operation?
He was there, but you got to think in 63, he was a nobody. In 63, the CIA approached people who had money and oil men and these kind of guys, rich people, to do their patriotic duty and assist the CIA. And that's exactly what George Bush was then. This is like, 15 years before he becomes the head of the CIA. So no, people put way too much emphasis on him. But here's the deal. Everybody was in Dealey Plaza that day. Everyone was in Dallas. They had to have been because it was a sort of ritual and they all had to be there. And therefore, of course, Bush was there. I mean, what did he say? He said he was at a Kiwanis Club meeting in East Texas, and then he had some other excuses. But no, he was in Dallas. But the fact that he was in Dallas to me is not overly telling because they were all there, all of them. I mean, like all of them. I'm pretty convinced Angleton, Morales, the whole JM Wave station, which included Ted Shackley and George Joanitas, like all of these guys had to be there. That's why Dealey Plaza was a controlled scene. Like when you look at how Dealey Plaza filled up, it was controlled from the jump. They only let certain people in there. Roads were blocked off by the cops. I mean,
okay, one last question before we go out. You probably got about 40 seconds to answer this one. So, what about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? He's running for president with or without brainworms, but he also seems to be down with both the deep state and the Zionists. Can he still be considered can that still be considered as a consequence of the assassination of his uncle?
I can't figure that guy out. When we first were introduced to him in the modern era and what he was doing and how it seemed like a good thing. It seemed like, wow, do we really have a Kennedy coming to fix things? But then, God, his interactions with Rabbi Shmuley and all that stuff just like went to show that he is controlled opposition at its finest. I mean,
You
there's no way in hell that I can see him as being anything positive. I mean, he's not so stupid that he doesn't know Israel killed his uncle and his father.
Yeah, indeed. Cory Hughes, you are, like I say, a powerhouse. Thank you so much for coming on the Johnny Vedmore Show. I really appreciate it, my friend.
Thanks for having me.